Our policy platform identifies 4 policy zones, which are access to comprehensive health care, economic mobility for families, investment in early childhood education, and justice and equity for youth. So now I invite you to enjoy this panel, which will be moderated by Leslie. Reverend Starcy gave an introduction to all of our panelists, and looking forward to this conversation. Leslie, take it away.
Thank you, Vanessa. I know folks are getting a coffee. Hope you got a stretch. I'm going to sit here, and can you still hear me? My microphone's on. Okay, heads are nodding. So thanks so much to each of these leaders for joining our panel. And we're going to start by zooming in on each of the campaigns that you're involved with. And if you would each take, maybe just 4 or 5 minutes to introduce yourself, talk about the work that you're focused on, and then once we've heard from everyone, we're going to dive in and start talking about how some of these movement best practices affect your campaign and are being affected by. Michelle, why don't you start?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Higgins. I'm one of the organizers for the Close the Workhouse campaign. I'm also excited to serve the Electoral Justice Project, which is under the Movement for Black Lives. I also serve as the co-chair for Action St. Louis, which is having an incredible campaign right now around voter education. So between the St. Louis groundswell of looking at how protest and politics have to interplay, it's been an incredible time for the Close the Workhouse campaign to be coming out of a week of action. And so just as a quick bio for our campaign, we are member-based and we're member-driven, and that means the most impacted people are always centered, and that is, it's a challenge. It's a challenge because our campaign to close the workhouse, which is our central demand, also happens to be constantly surrounded with the question, how do we support and serve the people that we are inviting and hoping to lead, that we want to follow? And so we have a number of things. I hope, is our research here? Yeah. Yes, so I hope that you'll read our recent release. There's so much in there. If you want to know our plans, our targets, why we believe the workhouse should be closed, I think my place here is just to tell you that our campaign is built from the most impacted people out to the folks that need to believe their inspirational stories and to stop arguing with indisputable facts.
Stanley?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Stanley Jackson. I am with the Fight for 15 campaign here in St. Louis. And even nationally, we have a campaign that's all across the nation and even abroad, overseas. I have been with this campaign for the last 5 years, fighting for economic justice for low-wage workers across the nation, specifically targeting the McDonald's Corporation, letting them know that we are not asking them for $15 an hour. We're demanding to be paid $15 an hour and the right to form a union. We have never asked for a minimum wage increase. We've asked for $15 an hour and the right to form a union. So I just wanted to stress that and let folks know, because there's people that were asking what's the difference. Well, why would we raise minimum wage to 15? Minimum wage could stay where it is. Minimum wage could be whatever they decided to be. What our campaign was focusing on was $15 an hour and the right to form a union. So we've been doing that for the last 5 years, and I'm proud to say that we've gotten increases all across the nation for millions of low-wage workers, not just fast food, but hospital workers, CNAs, janitors. So I'm very proud of the work that we have done, but we are still in this fight, and we will continue till we get what we deserve, not ask.
I'm Rich Patton. I am on the Community Advisory Board for Deaconess. and I retired at the beginning of the year as Director of Vision for Children at Risk. And I realized when Starsky asked me to do this, being retired makes you dangerous. You were unconstrained when you were when you were retired. I guess the one issue I've been unable to quit thinking about in retirement is early childhood development and the way we pursued that in this community over a long period of time now. I cannot think of an issue that's more critical, more central to the well-being of kids or to racial equity than that issue of early childhood development. And we've just not made the progress, I don't think, in that arena that we should, either in the St. Louis region or in the state of Missouri. And as Leslie presented herself and as I read her book, you could do all the check boxes to maybe where we went wrong. But the one thing that really jumped out at me, and I think is a need for focus in this arena, is the notion of adversarial allies. When I read that in the book, and that's the first time I came across that term, I thought, yikes, that's us. That's St. Louis. That's the way we do broad civic business. I think that's the way we've done business around early childhood development. It even occurred to me falling asleep one night, is we are so good at it, there might be a monument to adversarial allies someplace in a civic plaza or a park here. I did a little driving around and I've not found it, but I'm not sure that it's not out there. So I think that I will do that by way of introduction and stop there.
Stick with Rich for a second. So it sounds like you've done some thinking about how these practices apply to early childhood here in Missouri. So share some of your thoughts about where you went right and where you went wrong, and then we're going to talk to Michelle and Stanley too.
I think one thing that we've not done that you suggest in your talk and in your book is approaching the issue of early childhood as a movement. I think we have approached it more on a project or initiative basis than as a broad-based movement. That falls in, I think, into the leaderful notion. We have not particularly, and I know this firsthand, we have not worked from the grassroots up in the early childhood. It's been more middle out, nor have we had top-level community leadership. I know Lisa asked a question about successful early childhood movements. Well, Illinois, with the Preschool for All initiative, is startling in the extent to which they work bottom up and top down. I think the funding is a big part of that. If you look at the funding in some place like Illinois, right across that wide river, a huge amount of ongoing high-level foundation support for the early childhood movement. So I think those are the main things that pop to mind. You can go down a whole long checklist. Collaboration, I think, is at the heart of it. I mean, that's the notion, I think, that lies behind adversary. And any initiative, as Leslie said, there's conflict. My field is collaboration. That field first was conflict resolution. All the principles of collaboration came out of conflict resolution. And the reason conflict resolution went away is people didn't want to have conflicts. No, we don't have a conflict. Oh my, no. Well, yeah, you do. And the question is how you manage those, how you integrate those things, how you simultaneously get needs met.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about education, providing education in the pre-K space, and also how we deliver public education in this country. The nature of that work drives a lot of resources and the attention to service providers, the daycare centers, the pre-K schools, right? And it's very, very hard for those schools to take on any, additional advocacy to solve the systemic challenges that might be hitting their schools, right? So we talked in Forces for Good about needing to advocate and serve. And I guess what's missing here is at the national level, any organization or campaign that's thinking, okay, how do we take it off the backs of the service providers and help pull together a larger advocacy for some of the systemic solutions? Are there any national groups that you've worked with or aware of that?
Yeah, Pew had a big 10-long-year initiative, system-level focus, came to Missouri very late, but they focused on system stuff, employed a lot of the principles that you outlined there, and now they've moved on as funders and foundations do. They have moved on to that, but we never did that in Missouri, they gave us kind of as a pity gift at the end, they gave the state $85,000 to hire a director. We couldn't hire a director. I mean, we could not hire somebody to do the work statewide because of the infighting and the politics between organizations.
Okay. All right, so Stanley, let's talk about, do any of these practices of successful movements resonate with you more than others? Which ones have you embraced in your Fight for 15? Which ones might you want to dial up more if you're not doing them? What are your thoughts?
If I may, can I focus on one of the points that you brought up?
Sure.
Your final point, actually, which resonated with me, is that change can happen. And that really, for whatever reason, it really stuck out with me. When this campaign started 5 years ago, a lot of people laughed at us. Oh, that'll never happen. Who's laughing now? And I say that because, not braggadocious, but I say that because there are a lot of people who never envisioned a low-wage worker making $15 an hour, let alone the right to have a union. And then you also spoke about Walmart voluntarily raising their wages. Well, they didn't voluntarily do that. They did it because, I think, if I may say, they were afraid of us. If I can say that. I think that Walmart was afraid of the Fight for 15 campaign and the power of the people, because we believed that change could happen. If you hit a person in the face long enough, they're gonna bow. And we've been attacking the McDonald's Corporation because we felt that change could happen. And then not only the Walmart, but Amazon is now increasing their wages to $15 an hour. And I say all of that to say nobody was doing that before this campaign started. So we were laughed at one time. We were made fun of at one time. But because of the people like someone that I have here today, if you don't mind, Betty Douglas, would you please stand? This is Betty Douglas, and she's a worker here in St. Louis, Missouri. She works at the McDonald's at 1420 Hampton, the one with the playground. That's how it's identified. But she's a low-wage worker who's been a part of this campaign. She's a voice in this campaign. She's also one of our leaders who just came back from London with their campaign, and they wanted to know, what are we doing that is working? And it's because we believe change could happen, and she is a result of that. And we're not going to stop until we get, as I said, what we deserve. So that's one of the things that I want to speak on.
It's great. Yeah, it's a great point about Walmart, and let's dig into that a little, because I did say they voluntarily raised the minimum wage. It was voluntold. I get it, but there's no federal mandate, right? There's no regulation or law that said that they had to not, totally take advantage of its lowest wage workers. Walmart got a lot of heat because of this consumer activism and citizen action, and leadership changed, and they decided to lean in. They were known as one of the worst companies for workers' rights, and, by the way, for the environment too. Kathleen McLaughlin, who heads up their CSR corporate responsibility initiatives now, has a vision where Walmart, as the largest retailer company in terms of sales on earth, and Amazon too, online, how do they create more shared value, right? Like, how can they still make a profit, but also make a social and environmental impact? So, taking carbon out of their footprint. They're working on the environmental, trying to make peace. And I think it's a great point, which is that companies are more and more moving to trying to be more responsible, but this is not out of the goodness of their hearts, right? What is it? Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And you got to demand it, and people in power have to listen and heed. And I think what you're seeing is change in leadership in companies creates an opportunity to hear and respond to these demands in a way that for many years we didn't have. But of course, if you go all the way back to the 30s and 40s in the post-Depression era, we had very strong unions, right? When we were in the industrial age, it was a very different moment for workers' rights because they were organized, connected, and empowered. So great points. Michelle, what about you? What thoughts do you have in terms of what's working, what you want to do more of?
We were over here taking notes. So our campaign manager, Montega Simmons, is here. Shout out to Montega. We're very excited to have a solid team. But we were over here taking notes like, yes, change hearts, public awareness, and the mass public education campaigns that are the center point of really an abolition demand to close a jail and to not replace it. So what we're saying is when we close this jail, the 95% of people who are in there who haven't faced trial, who most of them are suffering under guise of debtor's prison foolishness, when the jail is closed, where will they go? What will you do with them? I hope they go home. Sadly, if you've been in the workhouse for about the average number of days, which is over 180, you don't have a home. And so in order to fulfill this demand, to really experience success, we have to change the idea that public safety is Black invisibility. And we have to change that idea into public safety is community wellness. Public safety is child well-being. Public safety is jobs. Public safety is access to education. And public safety is not criminalizing every possible point there is on Blackness and the working class. And so currently St. Louis does operate fiscally and politically from the position of public safety equaling Black invisibility, and it has done so. The history is there. It's indisputable in terms of our segregation, everything that we have in common with so many other mid-sized cities. But what is true in terms of changing policy is that if we push and shift for the divestment from, what are we at? What percentage for public safety of our city budget are we at? Some of y'all know this. It's high. It's high. Yeah, it's 53. And what are we at for health and human services? What percentage of the St. Louis city budget? 0.6. Yeah. So we got some work to do. And I believe that a big part of what you were saying about adversarial allies, that is shifting in part because we are moving from inertia to urgency, which is a base platform. The idea of the Obama campaign used this, moving people from, I'm tired, I'm poor, I'm unheard, I can't be amplified. How do we instill a sense of urgency that you can make a difference? This organizer's drive that says, I want to put myself out of a job because everyone around me has such a deep sense of urgency that we're going to shut this workhouse down. And we have already done the campaigning to the average person in here who has been conditioned to believe that anyone who is behind bars deserves to be there. That anyone who receives a plate full of roaches and boiled fake eggs has done something wrong to get themselves there. So we're taking the civil rights movement, our legacy of the bootstraps theory, that if you don't have boots, good luck building your bootstraps with no straw. Go ahead and make your bricks, and we ain't gonna give you no straw, but you gotta build your own house. So we're jacking up that bootstraps theory and bringing it up into the current climate to say, each of us has a point of privilege that we have to interact with. And if I can ask you to interact with, to counter, and then to manipulate your never been impacted by incarceration privilege, then maybe you, my precious liberal, my precious progressive, maybe you can deal with the same thing that the average conservative anti-abolitionist has to face, and you will begin to be less afraid to counter anti-abolition and to say, you know what? I have been conditioned to despise people in jail too, and I had to deal with that. And now that I'm dealing with that, and it's a journey, but now I can say I do want to close the workhouse because I've had to admit that I was raised to be afraid of people in jail. So changing hearts is what we have to do right now as we prepare to target the politicians and the elected officials who can really shift that to that divestment from jail.
It's the first time I've thought about this issue, again, from the perspective of, we know what we're against, right? Overcriminalization of the black and brown community. But what are we for? We're for public safety. And public safety resides in taking care of all of us. And that's exactly the direction I think you're going to get traction when you go there, because there needs to be something for white people of privilege to buy into, and the people that are the oppressed. So let's stay on this for a second, since we're on this issue. I'm curious what you all think, and you in the audience too, about the larger racial justice movement. I mean, I feel like we're at ground zero here in the St. Louis region, post-Ferguson and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think a lot about, what is the trajectory for Black lives when I think about the successful movements in the book. And would anyone on the panel like to talk about the larger fight for racial justice and equality, and how the larger movement is either employing some of these concepts or maybe could ramp up some of these approaches? I think we got to go back to Michelle. Yeah.
We're all looking at
How y'all doing? It's a privilege and an honor. That's right. It's also helpful to be a person of faith, so we can look at what I really appreciate about the current abolition movement is that we have a legacy of abolition in the Black community. And that legacy of abolition comes from our ancestors who knew somebody coming out of us has got to fight for our freedom. We said this the other day. I am my ancestors' expectations. I am doing my reasonable service to my ancestors, because when my ancestors came over on that boat, not the immigration boat, amen.
They didn't climb the wall.
You know what I'm saying? They rode over here, they were like, anybody that survives is a fighter. Anyone that hits the ground out of us is going to have to fight. And so we are our ancestors' reasonable act of service, okay? Can we be our children's wildest dreams? Can we end prison? Can we end child hunger? Can we do that? Let's be our babies' wildest dreams, because your ancestors already expected you to fight for freedom. And I believe that that's what the national movements and now the international movements are teaching us and reminding us. So I have a deep appreciation for the hyper-local 5 for 15 McDonald's on Hampton, because my baby's like, it's so big, the play place, we love it. So they know it. And when we went to protest there and we followed y'all and weren't thinking about, well, how can I get shine? Because Action St. Louis better represent. No. This, to me, is a bigger piece of all of us understanding that racial justice is more important. It's more important than an agenda that I have, because I want the people that I'm yelling and screaming for to come out of this jail when we close the workhouse into a job that pays $15 an hour. I want them to come out of jail and get their babies back and send them to early childhood education places that really surround and protect all of us. And so I do think that we're seeing an increase of collaboration in racial justice, in part because, well, I'm too traumatized to teach a room full of white people all the time. So you're going to have to do that for me. Just can't do that every day. Our movements are Black-led because they have to be Black-focused, because people of color need some healing on these streets. And if you were in Ferguson and you were part of the uprising, or you received secondhand trauma from the uprising, then you know what I'm talking about. Becky got to go talk to Aunt Becky at Thanksgiving. And you can use books and use our videos, but we have to be in this together, because on the days that we just can't, that I just can't go another further because my uncle and them are struggling behind bars in cages, you got to have some empathy for me so you can get your own, so your own can stop voting me into obsolescence. You have to get your own so that you can reduce the 53% white women. You have to get your own. If you love and have empathy for me, get your own so that when we get together at the table, you never have to tell me that you're a safe one. Because I'll be able to feel it in how we converse. I hope that answered the question I just started.
Yes, you did. I piggyback briefly because that doesn't need to be touched. That was good all by itself. But one of the things you asked a question earlier about what are one of the things that we feel that we did well, and one of the things that we wish we would have changed. I feel like we put a face on an opportunity. I feel like we put a face on what we were doing. But one of the things that I wish we would have done better is involvement all across the board from the beginning. Part of the reason is because we didn't know or anticipate how it would look and how it would turn out. But I wish that a little bit more research would have been done so that we can include even more people from the start. That way, this race may not have even taken so long. But the batons have been handed off and we'll continue to race. But she brought up an excellent point. Doesn't need to be touched anymore, but I just wish that we would have included even more people from the beginning of this thing rather than see how it unfolds and not be afraid to include whomever needed to be in the race. So.
Now, you mentioned something, Michelle, that I think is really important to highlight, how your group, you have an agenda, but you got behind the Fight for 15 because you see how it's all connected, right? So that's actually one of the really great approaches of all the successful movement leaders when they take and let's call it a campaign approach. So it made me start thinking in New York, when they got gay marriage in New York, how did Freedom to Marry go about driving for that? Here's the situation in New York. You got a bunch of LGBT rights organizations. HRC has a big chapter there, right? You have GLAAD, you have Empire State Gay Pride Agenda. You have all these adversarial allies, generally for the same thing, but fighting to get their members, their donors, their media moment, whatever. It's endemic to every field. So the strategic approach was Freedom to Marry went in and said, we're not going to set up a Freedom to Marry campaign and brand it Freedom to Marry, trademark. They created the New Yorkers United for Marriage campaign. Everybody could buy into that. There was New Yorkers United for Marriage T-shirts. There was the swag, and there was no one brand, no one organization, and no one policy platform that sort of took center stage. It was all about getting all the players together to kind of play in harmony, but they're not all singing the melody, right? So that's how the most effective organizers do it. And to do this, I want to point out, being leaderful, you have to be the kind of leader that can let go of ego. Yes. It's very, very hard to not get my own, and we all struggle for resources and all these things, right? So the best leaders we saw get power by giving power away. And it's a very complicated act. And I think it's one of the reasons why most movements fail, because they don't have the kind of leaders that can figure out that my success is tied into all of you succeeding. And it also is tied into the resources or lack of resources, like the no boots, fundamental. And so my message to funders, Deaconess, I know there's not that many private foundations in the region, but let's think nationally, because there's a lot with education reform. There's a lot of national funders that are starting to care a lot more about criminal justice reform, all these things. How can you, if you are a person of means, funnel the resources to the grassroots, to these local campaigns at that McDonald's? My 3 kids are happy once a week with their Happy Meal. How do you funnel the resources to those frontline grassroots activists, and that is an act of trust, right? And for too long, the money has flowed only to those organizations that are, either white-led, known to the people who own the resources, right? So that's got to change. And I have to say, that's one of the things that Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did really well under previous leadership, because they realized they had to push all the money out to those messy grassroots, can't necessarily measure and make them accountable kind of things. But, to build a movement, it's like lighting a match, and it's got to catch fire. And you can't control it and prescribe it. So there's lessons for, you were talking about what people of privilege need to do. Certainly people who hold purse strings need to fund these movements in different ways if they want to win. Let's go back to early childhood for a minute. I'm going to put you on the spot, Rich. So if you could wave your magic wand and have 3 changes at the state level, either from policy or norm perspective or business, what 3 changes do you think would tip the scales to having at least a chance of high quality early childhood education access for all children in Missouri?
Well, I would immediately pick up on your resource question. Missouri is a low tax, low service state, and we're proud of it. We don't fund much of anything, much less young children and their well-being. So I would I would start there. It's hard because in this state, so much of early childhood policy is ultimately controlled by the state in terms of regulation, in terms of the programs that support that, and we just we don't fund that. I think the second thing would be collaboration among state agencies. We've had a state level early childhood council that never rose above the political infighting. And I think somebody put it to me that nobody in the room could be more or different than their boss back in the central office. So that's not a recipe for change. And I think I would also bring the resource question down to the local level as well. There's an old saw that the battles are so bloody because the stakes are so small. And I think that drives a lot of what goes on in terms of nonprofits not collaborating. If the pie is a little bigger, it's easier to see that we can work together and you can get your share and I can get my share. But when you're operating hand to mouth, literally, particularly as a nonprofit agency, it's hard to be a little more open and a little more cooperative with folks. So at the state level, I would say the resources and the mindset, the way we approach government issues and collaboration among those state agencies.
Yep, certainly when you can take a collective impact approach and figure out ways to, rising tide lifts all boats. I've seen examples in other states on other issues where we've done some work with FSG in Massachusetts around substance abuse, particularly drinking. This was from about a decade ago, before the opioid epidemic kind of exploded and also came into the attention because of its impact on, right or wrong, the impact on white communities and privileged communities. Of course, it was an epidemic long before that in poor communities. But when organizations come together to collectively tackle an issue, it also makes you eligible for different kinds of funding, right? So 2 nonprofits in Massachusetts came together to create CTC, Communities That Care. Then they were eligible for a CDC grant that sent in $250,000 into that community that no one nonprofit was eligible for, but because they had a collective approach, a systemic approach, they could do more, right? So it opens up doors when you figure out ways to collaborate. Let's talk to the audience. What's on your minds? What questions do you have? Yes, in the back. And I don't know if anybody could bring them a microphone just so we can hear. But if you want to stand and project loudly while we look for a microphone, that would be great. We have one. Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to say thank you all for what you all have talked about. Love all you all's work. But the one thing I have not heard you all talk about is accountability to those that you all are representing. And what do I mean by that? I heard Mr. Jackson talk about, raising up for $15 an hour. The benefits and the access that brings that to Mr. Patton, which is early education. You know, and when you come north of Delmar, there is no accountability. We have duplication of things that have failed. So what will you all do moving forward to help hold the people that you represent and those that are in the same fields to help bring an opportunity to thrive, to provide that to the people that you all serve? Because we point the fingers at white people, politicians, but the people we're fighting for, we have no expectations for them. Or I should say, we don't have any solutions. Because you closed the workhouse, all right, you said you want them to come home. They don't have a home. We got a lot of derelict buildings. Can that be a construction program to help them rebuild their communities? So that's just it. I don't know if that's really a question more than a comment, so I'm sorry.
There's a couple of questions in there.
Well, I would answer briefly. I think the starting point is to put the folks you're talking about in decision-making capacities, because they are not there by and large at this stage. And the responsibility question you raised, I think, comes down the road. It's a legitimate question. It's a thorny question. But first, you have to put the folks who are affected by the things we've talked about and the outcomes of those in a position to make decisions, to put solutions, answers, whatever you want to call them, in place.
I'll start out saying a couple of things. First, I want to apologize to everyone in the room. The person that I brought, this is part of the reason why we're doing this fight. She has to be at work at 11 o'clock. When I originally set this up, we were supposed to be here for the panel or the breakout sessions. But because she works a low-wage job, she had to take off work Friday and Monday. She can't miss today. So I have to cut out. So I do apologize. That's part of the reason, again, why we're doing this fight. She should have that time available to her if she would choose so. But unfortunately, she does not. That's why we're continuing to fight. So I want to throw that out there. But to your question, most of the people in our campaign live north of Delmar. So we're trying to empower them and educate them on knowing what their position is and knowing that change can happen. So we're telling them, hey, you're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing this for everybody north of Delmar. You're doing this for the next generation that's coming up so that they won't have to work a low-wage job making less than $15 an hour, because generationally that has been happening. And I'm glad she brought up the point about the bootstraps, because I was going to do that. This game of life that we're playing, we're not all dealt the same deck of cards. And the unfortunate thing is we still are required to play. So that being said, everybody that's in this campaign, we're trying to empower them, letting them know that we're putting them in key positions and key roles. We're trying to organize, as she said again, ourselves out of a job, strengthening those numbers and letting them know that your voice shall be heard, not can be heard. It shall be heard, because we're going to beat the streets. We're going to be out there. We're going to hit the polls, doing everything necessary so that we can make that change happen. And there shouldn't be a north of Delmar. It should be equality for all.
Yes. St. Louis is one of the most philanthropic metropolitan areas in the country in terms of, giving, right? United Way is very strong here. But we don't have a large community foundation. We have a community foundation, but it's relatively small compared to other metropolitan areas around the United States. Most of the funding comes from corporate foundations and, frankly, recently, wealthy individuals. And what we see is they want to invest in programs. This is Rich's point. They want to invest in programs, not initiatives, and certainly not advocacy. In the area that I work in, community development, we've been struggling to get a fund to really lift up the capacity of community development corporations to do neighborhood planning. That sort of grassroots capacity, and it's been a struggle just to get a few $1 million over a several-year period. But we raised $350 million to fix up the Arch grounds. We raised over $200 million to fix up Forest Park. Apparently, we've raised a couple $100 million for the Arch to Park initiative. But advocacy and organizing, capacity, grassroots capacity building is not being funded in this region. So is there some way to persuade, that you talked about this already, but some way to persuade those that have the resources to take a risk and organize people? That may make them even uncomfortable at one point, but they seem, especially in St. Louis, reluctant to put money out there for high-risk money in some ways to advocate and organize and not just run a program.
You're talking about St. Louis, but you're talking about every community in America. I mean,
This is an exception. In the last
Thank you very much. Thank you.
right. Well, even Deaconess started out on this journey by starting to fund nonprofit capacity. Thank you for coming. Building nonprofit capacity, and that movement was in the philanthropic world. You had an organization called Grant Makers for Effective Organizations. The idea was not just to fund, the particular soup kitchen program, but fund the nonprofit, fund the food bank with general operating support. And the idea being, when you buy stock in a company, if I buy stock in Apple, which is really expensive right now, so I didn't buy any stock in Apple. You buy, you fund the whole company, right? And they use that to invest in growth. You don't say, I want this just to go to the next version of the iPhone, but I definitely don't want this to pay for any marketing, or outreach, right? So there was this movement in philanthropy to start funding whole organizations and nonprofits, and then build their capacity to do high impact work. The challenge is that part of that advocating and serving is not just, it's a blind spot for funders, but it's also a blind spot for a lot of nonprofits, because my mission is to get food into the hands of hungry people. I run a food bank. Well, Feeding America went through a big transformation when they realized, we can't feed as many hungry people. We can't alleviate suffering unless we advocate for better programs like TFAP, which is the food assistance program, to expand that so government is doing more so that private nonprofits can also do more, and having that systems view. So nonprofits in this country, any nonprofit can advocate. As long as you keep your lobbying and advocacy within a certain percentage, it's fully legal. All the high-impact nonprofits and Forces for Good did all the lobbying they needed to. You can't go so far as to say vote for or vote against a certain candidate, but everything short of that, totally open game, and funders can fund it. But it was a very big, I talked about Robert Wood Johnson Foundation under Steve Schroeder going into tobacco control. That was not a decision taken lightly. They knew that when they decided to fund advocacy and coalitions, that they were drawing the ire of the tobacco industry. Nancy Kaufman, head of this program at Robert Wood Johnson, would get death threats. They were the ones that published the first cigarette papers that showed that companies knew that tobacco was killing people, right? It's not for the faint of heart, right? But it's also legal. And I think what we need to do is start showing the connections. We can't, you talked about having a community foundation here. I don't think that charity and philanthropy are going to be the answer alone going forward. I think, what's smart about your 15 campaign here, when you're targeting McDonald's, you're going back to that idea of forget trying to get some federal minimum wage. Let's go to these huge companies that have more resources than many federal agencies. If we can get that company to change its policy through pressure as well as negotiation, then you can actually get a company to change its policy so much faster than you can a country, right? So taking those companies one by one is an opportunity. You can get some leverage there. There's a great book that's out right now. I don't know if anybody's read it, Winners Take All. New York Times reporter wrote it, and it looks at where we got with our post-industrial economy and the dynamic scheduling and the idea that we're not providing benefits and real wages have remained relatively flat, for decades, while the richest class has, gained so much more. And part of what you're up against in this fight is not just McDonald's choice to oppress, right? McDonald's is competing against these global players, and there's all these other pressures. So it's a much thicker, complicated morass of systems challenges that you're up against than just that one. But if you can start with these canaries in a coal mine, like McDonald's or like Walmart, then I think about the work of Environmental Defense Fund and the environmental movement. Their first push in the 90s was to partner with McDonald's because of all the waste, the unrecycled packaging, and the pollution. By just getting McDonald's to get rid of the styrofoam clamshells that the Big Macs were in, and putting recycled materials into its packaging, cutting down, they were able to reduce it by hundreds of thousands of metric tons over a period of time. But what's more, because McDonald's made this move under pressure, then KFC and Wendy's and everybody else has to follow suit, and you get that ripple effect. So again, targeting companies and getting that ripple effect is a way you can get some traction now, while I don't know how long we have to wait for some fair federal approach. You have a comment, Michelle?
Let me respond, if I could, to Todd's question and qualify it. My wife always tells me I've got answers and not solutions. So I think I have an answer to your question, but but not a solution. One is, I think in St. Louis, and when I did conflict resolution and collaboration, we did it all over the country. St. Louis, because of its history, because of the way we fragmented ourselves at every level possible, we have less of a sense of common good in this region than most other regions. So there's no common good to fund. And I know our reputation is a very philanthropic community. I've often wondered how much of that money goes to people's self-interest. How much of that goes to my private high school or to the symphony, if I'm interested in that, rather than to community development. I also think that we just have, and I guess if I could ever, in retirement, get blueberries to grow on my blueberry plants as opposed to just leaves, I'll go into that. I think you could do an Excel spreadsheet and see that there are fewer resources in this community than there were 50 years ago. I mean, we have half the number of Fortune 500 corporations, and obviously all of those corporations had corporate trusts. Big foundations like Danforth have gone away. So I think the pie might be smaller. I think that could be quantified. But I think in my mind, the real base of your question, the real root of that problem is a lack of a sense of community good with all our municipalities and school districts and our billions of private schools. There's not a common good. There's not community development to fund.
Last question, then we're going to go to breakouts and dive even deeper.
Great. Well, first, I just want to say thanks to Deaconess Foundation for putting on this series, and thanks to all of you all for being here and responding to the questions as well. So I'm interested, as we talk about movements and how they get started, I think the biggest thing for me is really how we sustain them. And so I'm curious if you all could speak to how we can sustain movements. And I'm sure invariably you'll touch on things within politics or the economy, but I'm much more focused on things from the social side of it. So if I could have someone speak to that as well.
Why don't you throw your question out too, and we'll tackle them together.
So my position in St. Louis, I'm a grant writer. One of the biggest problems in St. Louis, not necessarily so much the funding. Like we were briefly going over breakfast, how one group passed up $25 million because they couldn't actively get participants together to put their name on a piece of paper and participate and get that funding. We have housing funding, $293 million for one development, $80 million for another development, $20 million for another development, $5 million and $1 million for another development currently on the table that people are not actively going after to get the money and put it into community development for here in St. Louis. In addition to that, we got this race issue. I'm not even going to talk about that. Finally, our families would fare much, much better if we were a 700 credit score community. We can do that for our families for free. We have a lot sitting in this room that could benefit from that. If we were a 700 credit score community or better, there's a lot of funding that we could apply for. There's a lot of giving that we can do to each other. There's a lot of families that we can save. I don't know about you, but as a single mom of 4 in the Central West End, $15 an hour was not enough for me to feed my babies. So, thank you.
Speaking of sustaining movements, right? The way to sustain, at least from what most of us have been either trained in or either tapped into, is this understanding that, so Dr. King said it, you're going from just a neighborhood into a brotherhood. So going from just being neighbors into actually loving the kids across the street as much as I love my babies. Because all these babies is God's babies, is how I came up. And I think that that makes it more important for us to see common good as a reason to draw in, to put our names on one piece of paper, no matter what my adversary is. We are co-advocates for somebody's well-being. And so now, understanding that, seeing that, I move from movement and organizing for the sake of my single central demand. And I understand that we have co-laborers that have co-demands. Socially, sustaining a movement really is about changing how you live. And I'm just going to answer the social piece because I think there's more systemic and organizational pieces. But to change how you live is to say, I now understand that my LGBTQIA friends love each other. And that's why I support their marriages. That's changing how I live. It changes how I vote. It changes me if I'm a person of faith who's an evangelical who thought, I just wish that abortion was illegal, and that's it. And then you look around and you see that you actually are voting people out of opportunities to bring life into the world, because our prenatal systems on the north side, the access is so low. And so if I change how I live, if I change how I think, if I change my empathy patterns, then I'm participating in the sustenance of a movement by saying, I'm not going to just argue for one issue that I have been told is the only single truth. Then you actually look around, you open your eyes, and you begin to see that we're bringing all of this money in for parks because green grass and trees matter more than black and brown babies in the city of St. Louis. And that's, if I say that, and if it's believed because it's true, the truth is what helps us sustain, because the truth is what changes us and how we live, and it's really what begins to connect us to each other. So my low ego, or practicing low ego, trying to strive for it and grab it, only creates high impact if I move into a space where I sense deep equality, or at least the desire thereof, because we ain't there yet. We're not to equality yet. Liberation is yet to come on the other side of that. But if we lower our egos and move into spaces where multiple demands center the truth, then our movements are automatically sustained, because I have no reason to believe that empathy can't win between us.
Please join me in thanking this amazing panel.